Hi, everyone. This is Chapter 12 about cognitive development in middle childhood. So now we're talking about Piaget's third stage, right? We had the sensory motor stage, the pre-operational stage, and now the concrete operational stage. So it's important to think about where we came. Stu- Children were only able to think with their senses and their motor capabilities. Then they were very limited, very egocentric, and had a hard time taking others' perspective. But now they're more logical, more flexible, more organized, and it's again through direct experience and perception. So now they have the ability to conserve. They know just because you change the appearance of something, it doesn't actually change the value. So if you look here at a math example, 4 plus 2 equals 6 is the same as 6 minus 4 equals 2. That is conservation. They used to centrate, meaning they could only focus on one thing at a time. Now they can decentrate and listen to multiple steps and procedures. They now can demonstrate reversibility, and memory helps in thinking backwards in the steps that have happened previously. Classification, they love to collect things, like here are Pokemon cards. My sons loved to collect those when they were young. Now, spatial reasoning is about understanding their position in space in relation to other objects and other people. So at this age, they could maybe give simple directions like, oh, I live behind the McDonald's, or you go straight and then turn right and then turn left and then you're at my house. Right? It's not very clear, but you can tell they understand space. And lastly is seriation, or arranging in a logical sequence, such as understanding that 12 is less than 17. Those skills are starting to be developed within this stage from 6 or 7 to 11 or 12 years old. Now, what about Vygotsky and thinking about this age? Well, again, culture plays a big part into it. So, scaffolding helps move children from potential to knowledge, helping them get in that zone and understanding that new concept. And think about culture affects how children learn, not just what they learn. So, there's a Blackboard video where you can learn more about Vygotsky and culture. Now, theory of mind is also furthering being developed. They start to understand now that the mind is constructive. If they work on things, they can memorize things better, right? So, school really helps engaging a child's theory of mind. And what about information processing theory? So, that's kind of where theory of mind falls. It falls under the information processing, where they look at the mind more like a computer than a human being. So there's all these components to memory: sensory memory, working memory, and long term memory. So we only keep sensory memory for a few seconds. Working memory can be about 5 to 15 seconds, and long term is permanent. So think about that in terms of our expectations of what children remember. Here is more about those capabilities. So you can pause here and read a little bit more in terms of the different age groups. So now let's focus on a few areas that incorporate neurodiverse learners, right? Because each person has neurological strengths and challenges that need to be appreciated and valued. So let's learn about some neurodiverse components, such as gifted and talented children. So, gifted is typically measured by a high IQ, and the children typically show exceptional intellectual strength. They test very well, they comprehend well, and they perform well. Talented children, on the other hand, might have a performance of a certain field, where they have divergent thinking and creativity that we don't typically see at that young of an age. So, artistic ability may fall under that area. Now, autism is a developmental disorder. And again, it's difficulty with social communication, interaction, difficulty with perspective, and sometimes repetitive patterns of behavior. So, again, difficulty understanding how others feel, maybe delayed language, impaired social interactions. It does originate in the brain, and there are genetic and prenatal influences. So, signs and symptoms are listed on our Blackboard page, and you can get a little bit more information. What about children with ADHD? So, ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and typically under 10% of children are diagnosed. Now, I do have a Blackboard video that you can watch about how do they diagnose children with ADHD. Well, they look for symptoms such as inattention or impulsivity or lack of focus. And the origins are typically hereditary. Many times parents have had the same struggles, or it can also be related to stressful home life. So think about that in terms of nature versus nurture. The nature side of ADHD looks at the brain as having an issue that needs to be treated. They do brain scans, they see differences in a child with ADHD versus without, and so they're going to treat in a very specific way. Nurture side would start more with therapy and trying to get to the root of the issue. Were there prenatal teratogens that the child was exposed to? Are there other stressors at home which may give us insight into why the child is having difficulty focusing? Well, nurture side will also have a different style of treatment. So, if nature believes ADHD is a brain issue, then medication would be prescribed, right? Because it's something going on biologically that needs treatment. Nurture, on the other hand, would look at maybe therapy or modifications in the classroom before prescribing medication. So, what they find is stimulant medication typically reduces symptoms in about 70% of children, but there are risks with these drugs. Many children's eating patterns or sleeping patterns are affected, or even their overall behavior. So, what they do find is medication combined with interventions like therapy and modifications typically are the most successful. Now, what about learning disabilities? About 5 to 10% of children are diagnosed with some kind of learning disability. Typically, we see it in reading. Many times they're mainstreamed, meaning they are in a special needs classroom, but are brought into a regular classroom based on their skills. So I was a long-term substitute in fourth grade classroom, and a child who was actually sixth grade age would come into our classroom during math time. So he was in a special needs class for the majority of the day, but he would come into our classroom based on his skill in math. That is mainstreaming. Now, what we encourage the most as possible is inclusion, where children with different abilities learn with other children in the same classroom. So, I have a Blackboard video and I really would love you guys to watch it. It's called Shelley Moore Transforming Inclusive Education. And she talks about how we just need to change our aim and we could hit children on all areas of development. So, inclusion again is having children in the classroom, learning along with all the other children, but maybe getting some additional supports like having someone come in as a one on one or going out of the classroom for RSP or speech or something like that, right? So, as much as possible for the child's well being, we try to encourage inclusion. Now, the final part of this chapter will look at IQ. So, your intelligence is looked at, and there's differences, right? Well, genetics play into that, your past information from your parents and their intellect, but your environment. What are you exposed to? What knowledge do you have at your fingerprints or fingertips? Sorry about that. Well, the way that we assess intelligence is typically through two types of tests when children are young. The Stanford Binet test is for ages 2 to adulthood and looks at, again, general knowledge, quantitative, visual spatial, working memory. Whereas the Wechsler intelligence scale is aimed more at younger children, 6 to 16. They even have a preschool and primary revised edition. And they're looking at verbal reasoning, perception, spatial, working memory. And here are some sample questions you might see on these IQ tests. What day of the week comes after Thursday? Tell me what carpet means. Put this object into this space based on here. Remember these numbers, repeat them backwards. So, again, how they process on these is how they'll come out in their IQ tests. Now, Howard Gardner came about saying, okay, IQ tests are great, but they really only value these logical, mathematical, and linguistically competent students. What about other intelligences that still should be valued? So he found eight independent intelligences that allowed more culturally valued activities to be just as valued as others. And here are those eight intelligences. So you can pause here and kind of get a more picture association, but we're going to go over each one individually on their own slide. So logical mathematical children have the ability to detect logical and or numerical patterns. So they might do well in math as young children, do well with problem solving, and maybe as adults work with numbers as bankers, computer programmers, or astronomers. Interpersonal intelligence is the preference to get along with others. So when I see interpersonal, I think of interacting. They have an ability to interact with others. So school age children would love working in pairs or partners and being parts of teams. Adulthood, maybe you're working in customer service or as a therapist or a teacher or a salesperson. Spatial intelligence is, again, understanding your space in relation to others. So they might like arranging or organizing or building things as young children. And maybe that turns into being an architect or an athlete or a director when they're older. Musical rhythmic children, again, are probably involved with dance or music and performing, and maybe in adulthood become professional or work professionally in that area, or maybe teach it to younger children or work in different areas. Intrapersonal is more about a person. So it's liking being alone in your own thoughts. Journal writing, individual work would be school age children. And in adulthood, maybe being a philosopher or an author. Bodily kinesthetic is using the body skillfully. So children at this age would love sports and being in PE. And maybe as adults would be athletes or dancers. Verbal linguistic is forming thoughts and using language. So they might love debating or creative writing and discussions. Adulthood might be attorneys or translators. I always like to put this because I am not verbal linguistic. Me recreating an argument I had 6 hours ago with new and better points. It just doesn't come to me very quickly, whereas my husband has really fast comebacks. And the eighth area is naturalistic, the ability to recognize and classify the environment. So, school age children would love being outdoors, field trips, science experiments, and in adulthood might be in different forms of science. So, how do we approach these intelligences in our classroom? Again, because all children have strengths and challenges. Well, let's say we were to learn about fractions. We could incorporate music, quarter notes, that's a fraction. How about flower petals? Maybe we have children who are hands on learners or more naturalistic. How many yellow petals? Maybe 4 out of 9. What about poetic meter, the patterns of the beats? And again, that's music or verbal, and they can count the patterns. So we can always incorporate these different intelligences within our classroom, and many times can do it within the same lesson. So make sure to accommodate those different IQs. Email me with any questions.